raising her hand. She's always yelling out answers. She was always with the right answer. The teacher, in fact, and the teachers in the room will know that sometimes didn't want to call on her because they knew she had the right answer, right? So they wanted to give the kids a break. At the end of her first grade year, she was taken out of school. And the reason why she was taken out of school was because that family that was raising her wanted her to raise their kids, essentially kind of take care of them. So she only had 1 year of school. And I realized something then when she told me that story. I realized that I had found my feminist DNA. And I had found finally the kind of the makeup that made me who I was, which was here was this young woman, or actually elderly woman, and a young woman speaking to each other across the generations. And she was telling me how school empowered her to find her voice, even if it was just for that 1 year. And when she was telling me that story, I could feel the energy. I could feel how much she loved school just for that 1 year and how it gave her a voice. And I realized, I want to do that. That's why I do that. I do that every day, not only for myself, but for young people, to find who they are through storytelling, through narrative, through activism, through finding their voice in a world that often doesn't want to hear them. So I'll go back to my high school years. I grew up at a time when Anita Hill was testifying against Clarence Thomas in sexual harassment hearings just before Clarence Thomas was made Supreme Court Justice. I grew up at a time when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was made the second woman on the Supreme Court. Those were defining moments of my teen years. But the most defining moment, outside of historical moments, was a moment in an English class. We were reading James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And I remember going through the chapters of this book and reading it and really connecting to his story. This kid was bullied, first of all. I was bullied. I was called spick, I was called nigger, I was called afro, I was called all kinds of names as a kid because I was a little Puerto Rican kid growing up on Long Island in a public school and didn't have much diversity. And I was really hurt during those years. And so when I read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, I went, oh my God, this kid is being bullied on the playground. Finally a story that I can connect to. And then I watched him grow up in this novel. He was that poet who would write underneath the sheets. He went to college and read all these intellectual texts and kind of wanted to be a scholar and a writer. And I thought, this is my guy. But how come I haven't found my girl? And I read that story, and at the end of the novel, I said, I haven't read the novel about the young Latina girl, that brown girl on Long Island, who is this emerging queer feminist of color. Where's that story? How come my teacher hasn't brought that into the classroom? And I realized at that moment, that's what I need to do. I need to become that educator who brings those books into the classroom so that young people can see themselves straight back at them when they're reading, when they're writing, when they're reflecting, when they're journaling, when they're finding that voice that they so desperately need. So when I read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, I wound up writing this long analytical essay. It was an AP English class, and I went up to my teacher and I said, Mrs. Welcome, I really want to write a long research paper, bringing together portrait with other women writers, kind of analyzing how they're different from each other. She said, fine, go. So I went to my local public library and I found a treasure trove. I found Simone de Beauvoir. I found Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar's Mad Woman in the Attic, which is this classic feminist literary criticism. And I found just book after book after book, you know, Kate Millay's Sexual Politics, all these books. It was just like, they just kept coming and coming and coming and coming. And I was just overwhelmed. And I read Judy Chicago's autobiography about how she created the dinner party, which is in Brooklyn, actually, this beautiful feminist, classic feminist piece of art that shows the history of women, or at least a portion of the history of women, that was what then led me to finding the college that I went to, which was Smith College. And I really wanted to go to a women's college because I wanted to be immersed. It was like a bath and a spa. Like I wanted just to be immersed with other feminists, queer feminists, feminists of color, white feminists, everyone who could give me what I needed. So I went to Smith, and that also transformed my life. And it was one course that I took there that I'll never forget. It was a course on Latina and Latin American women writers. And I wound up reading people like Shani Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa and Ana Castillo and writing papers about them. And it was through reading those books that I said, finally, I'm reading the books I really need, and you're giving me the language that I need to understand myself as a queer, feminist woman of color who really needed that at that time. And I also needed an epiphany, which was, what am I going to do with this? And I said, I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to be a feminist teacher. And I'm going to bring that to the classroom. And throughout the course of my career, I've been able to bring those texts that transform my life, as well as other texts, into the classroom, so that young people have a lens. And in particular, my kind of feminism, I'll tell you right now, is a social justice feminism. It's an intersectional feminism. What do I mean by intersectional feminism? I mean that it's a feminism that not only looks at gender, but it also looks at race. It also looks at class. It also looks at ethnicity. It also looks at sexuality. It also looks at politics. It looks at human rights. And it uses that intersection, right? Those categories of identity, those categories of oppression, to understand the world around us. You could apply that lens to so many things: immigration, education, the environment. That intersectional feminist lens, we can use that to understand a lot. So when I started teaching right after college, I taught in girls' schools. And I think it's appropriate that I'm standing in a girls' school. And I really believe in single-sex education. I went to a women's college. And throughout my 7 years in girls' schools, I taught young women how to find their voices through narrative. And I challenged them to look at race and class and gender and sexuality by writing memoir. And they wrote these really powerful pieces. I'll never forget one girl who wrote a piece about being African-American and Jewish. Her mother's African-American and her mother's African-American, her father was Jewish. And she really felt kind of torn between her two identities. In some places she was too white. In other places she was too African-American. And she could never find, whatever that means, she could never find that space in between where all of her was accepted.